Looks fine.
Looks fine. All right.
Okay.
We're recording?
We're recording.
How you doing?
I'm good. I'm Amanda.
I'm Peggy.
You're watching the Junction Fiber Mill Millcast.
Yes, you are.
We are pre-recording this at the end of February. This is probably our last pre-recorded episode.
Yeah.
Before the baby comes. Or we might have one more live-ish episode in there. But
we'll see. We'll see. You came in late today. I was like, she's in labor.
No. My due date is 8 days away for all of those interested to know, but you're probably seeing this sometime on the other side. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
But
so,
we have someone very interesting.
I can't wait to introduce this gentleman to you and to you guys. We have tried hard to talk about the different breeds of sheep that we process the wool from, and just really trying to get across that when you're holding a skein of wool, it's coming from an animal. But I think the thing we haven't talked about much is the incredible impact that sheep had in New England, and in particular on the state of Vermont. Mm-hmm. And I reached out to a very beloved, I will call it local legend. His name is Steve Taylor. And when you meet him, he's going to introduce himself and all the things that he has done. But I want to say that on his business card, he's referred to as an independent scholar.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, he's an independent scholar. He farmer, and he'll introduce all the things that he's done. But I asked Steve to take us back to when did sheep come to New England, in particular to Vermont? What did it do to Vermont, and the lasting impacts it has had on the region? And I hope you enjoy this conversation. I found it absolutely riveting.
All right.
Okay, my name is Steve Taylor. I have had a life in newspapering, farming, and public service. I have been a farmer all my life. I grew up on a small farm. My father was a school teacher, but we always had animals, including a flock of sheep, probably 85 or 90 ewes, all during my childhood and teenage years. I became a newspaper man sort of by accident, but I was a reporter, and then I was an editor of daily newspapers. Did that for a while. Developed a farm with my sons and my wife. We developed a farm out of nothing. We cleared land, we built barns, we built a house, we did all kinds of things. And we were in the sheep business heavy for about probably 10 years. I worked in newspapers. After newspapers, I was a freelance writer. I did that for about 10 years. And then I became the Commissioner of Agriculture for the state of New Hampshire. I did that for a long time. Retired. We transitioned out of sheep and had a dairy farm. We milked to top probably about 85 cows. And then it was my son's decision, that it was their farm basically, to exit dairy farming in 2018, and we still raise heifers for another farm. And but I since I retired from state service, I do a lot of educational programs, lecturing on rural life, agricultural history of New England. And one of the most popular, I would say, most commonly requested lectures that I do is about the great sheep boom and its enduring legacy on the landscape of New England. So that's how I happen to be here today.
Yeah, so take me back. How in my quick little research, the big moment was about 1811 when a guy down in Wethersfield got a hold of 400 Merino sheep. What jump started? What kicked off the demand and the
1809? Thomas Jefferson was president. He appointed a Boston businessman named William Jarvis to be the American consul to the Spanish court. Jarvis was a successful businessman, obviously politically connected, and he also had an interest in agriculture, including a farm in Wethersfield Bow, Vermont, on the Connecticut River. A lovely, lovely farm. It's not exactly clear how it happened that he had his base in Boston, but he had this farm. Well, whatever, he operated that. Well, he went to take up his duties. He arrived in Spain, and one of the first things he did was go out in the countryside, and there he saw vast flocks of magnificent sheep with deep, wonderful fleeces, unlike anything back in his home country, back in the United States, where the sheep were, let's say, to be charitable, they were motley, they were not, they were more meat breed, they were a hodgepodge. Anyway, these sheep that Jarvis observed in Spain, on the Iberian Peninsula, were, we use a generic term today, Merino, but the Merino comes from the fact that their base stock moved over the Mediterranean Sea from North Africa. So Merino, that's the root of the word. But there were several different breeds, if you want to go way back, the Pashamantes and others. So anyway, Jarvis was very interested in these sheep, but at that time, European nobility resisted. They basically embargoed good breeding stock, whether it's cattle or horses or sheep or anything, from being exported to the New World, because they were concerned about competition, and so they wanted to lock up. But in 1809, at this time, Spain was under an imminent threat of invasion by Napoleon and his hordes, and so there was a desperate move to raise some money to wage war and defend the Spanish peninsula. And so with that, Mr. Jarvis and an Englishman were able to swing a cash deal to buy some of these sheep. And it's estimated that perhaps 6,000, some have said there were over 7,000 sheep were divvied up between these two interests, Jarvis from the U.S. and this Englishman. And half went to the British Isles, and the other half came to the United States. Soon there were others who got in on this and started bringing them over. But we have no conception of what they went through to get sheep here by boat. They had to bring along enough fresh water, they had to bring along feed for what could be a 60 to 80 day voyage. But they did it, and they brought, the first sheep were landed from Wiscasset, Maine, down through really to almost, Jersey, that area. But anyway, most of them came to New England. A large number of them came through the port of Newburyport, Mass. Jarvis, in his dealings, he had about 300 of these prize sheep cut out, and they had to be driven overland from the port of Newburyport to this farm that he owned in Wethersfield, Vermont, a distance of about 110 miles. I mean, there were no trucks, no rails, no nothing. They had to be driven overland. So that was what he arranged to have happen, and he did it. Well, word soon got around about these magnificent sheep suddenly appearing and coming from Spain. And people said, aha, we would like to get some of that breeding stock. And so almost instantly you had an incredible boom start. You had, just like the real estate bubbles, the dot-com bubbles, all of these things that we're familiar with today. In that time, people wanted to get in on it. They wanted to get their hands on a breeding ram or 2 or 3 ewes and get a foundation. And so there was an exponential growth in numbers of sheep tracing from this importation inspired by Mr. Jarvis's vision. The numbers of sheep in central New England grew by leaps and bounds in a decade's time. And so you look at the old tax records, and back in the old days, they taxed cattle and sheep. You look at for some of the towns in New Hampshire and Vermont, there were families, you could identify the owners. In a matter of 8 or 10 years, they grew from 10 or 15 sheep to 100, and some to 200. I mean, it was very, very remarkable. Now, to accommodate this, they had to have cleared a lot of land, because they needed pasture and they needed grassland to cut hay, because we have a short growing season in New England, so you need enough feed to carry the animals for almost 7 months of the year. And so from the time of the Revolution forward, land had been cleared very aggressively. And the example in New Hampshire, south of the White Mountains, in a matter of 50 years, they cleared the forest down to the point where it represented only about 20% of the land area. In other words, 80% was cleared land. An enormous undertaking, largely accomplished with fire. They burned down a lot of the forest just to, they were desperate to open land, and of course they cut a lot for timber, ships, masts, all of that, and a lot of the wood was burned for charcoal. Charcoal became the first cash crop for export in New England history, and so that was the way it got going. And with the sudden appearance of this resource of wool coming from these wonderful sheep and their offspring, suddenly you had a resource that attracted capital to construct mills to process and convert the wool into textile products. And that gave rise to, in New England, the mill town, and typically developed along a stretch of waterway where there was power, where it could be dammed and power could be obtained from water flow. And thus New England, particularly southern New Hampshire, southern Maine, eastern Massachusetts, and some into Rhode Island, Connecticut, hundreds of small, they call them manufactories. They were small mills that were water powered to convert wool into usable textile material products. And so it was exponential, the growth in the numbers of sheep in this region, and it brought about and attracted Boston and New York capital to build these mills. Some of them were wonderful masonry mills. Some of them were made of wood, whatever, anything to get the job done. Well, as this great boom matured, they began to encounter some serious problems. Number one problem, of course, was confinement. How in the world can we keep the sheep in? Steel wire had not been invented yet. Cut down most of the trees, so we don't have wood to make fences with. What have we got? Well, in New England we have a huge amount of stones, and so stones were put and made into walls, fences, and stone walls to keep the sheep confined. Number one, feed for all these animals. Big challenge. We have a very short growing season. We need enough feed to carry the animals for 7 months at least, and the balance with pasture, of course. All this feed had to be harvested by hand, again using every single available man or boy, women to harvest hay and cure it and put it in storage for the long cold winter. So that was a great challenge. Number three, we had problems with predators in this area. This was the New England natural habitat for the eastern timber wolf. and it became imperative to exterminate the timber wolf. If there was a sighting of a wolf, everything stopped, and weapons were secured, and they hunted down the wolves and got rid of them. They shot them off. Then they had a lot of problems with parasites and disease. Anytime you take ruminant animals and you build up the population, you run into parasite problems. They didn't have the pharmacy we have today to deal with what we call stomach worms or ticks or whatever. They tried a great variety of what you would call today homeopathic approaches. One of my favorite ones was they took a commonly grown plant around here and they pressed it and got the juice out of it, and they would take the juice and make a tea, and then they force some of this tea down the sheep's gullet. Well, what do you suppose that plant was? Nobody seems to guess it, but it was tobacco. Tobacco is a very toxic substance, and they felt that it was an effective treatment for stomach worms, parasites, intestinal parasites, which they had huge problems with, and they also used it as a surface topical treatment for another problem that afflicted them all the time, was foot rot. It's just pathology is basically a bacterial infection of the foot. Causes probably doesn't kill the sheep, but causes the sheep to be lame and not thrifty, and eventually probably could die of pneumonia or whatever. So anyway, all of that was a desperate hunt for a way to deal with this parasite problem. Another one was, of course, ticks, and there's some evidence or some school of thought that the ticks that sheep are bothered by today may have ridden here on some of those early loads of sheep that Jarvis and his successors brought over here. Anyway, sheep, they carry a load of ticks. Probably ticks won't kill the sheep, but they'll debilitate the sheep because they suck blood. And in my town, they would shear the sheep, and then they would dam up a brook and fill the pond with arsenic and drive the sheep through to try to kill the ticks. That was one thing. Obviously, in those days, they had no EPA to worry about. Then probably the biggest problem was chronic malnutrition. These great numbers of sheep and the kind of feed that they were able to put up meant that a lot of animals did not get enough protein and energy in their diet that they should. So malnutrition, chronic problem. And of course, in those days, it was traditional to do the haying in the month of July and August, and we know today that the plants that produce the hay are at their peak of nutritive value around Memorial Day, the first crop. But they didn't start harvesting until after the 4th of July normally. And so these sheep had to survive over the winter on feed that was, by today's standards, not very high quality. And so malnutrition and mortality was pretty significant. Sheep would just give up. They didn't have enough to eat, or they didn't carry the lambs. There were just all these problems due to the poor quality feed that was available. Very simple annual cycle we settled into early on. It was to lamb in the spring, and they loved to have turn ewes out with their new lambs, their new crop, on green grass, because they noticed that it made the mothers produce more milk. Others would get swollen up and plenty of milk, get the lambs off on a good start. Shearing often, for many operations, from what I've seen in my research, shearing was done in June. And the thinking was apparently that the heat made the wool softens the wool, makes it more easier to cut. And of course, they're cutting with hand clippers, if you can imagine. Anyway, so commonly sheared in June. Animals put on pasture, using uplands for pasture, and preserving what they call the intervale of the lower, flatter land for hay production. And breeding late fall, and wintering in very rudimentary, very practical housing. Shelters were very simple. Actually, they put more emphasis on having good barns to store the hay, and less on shedding for the sheep. But that was a very simple, just a very simple cycle. That was what everybody followed. The sheep numbers of New England, to me, are staggering today. 1834, New Hampshire, 465,000 head. Maine, 622,000. Massachusetts, 373,000. And then Vermont had 1.1 million. I mean, just incredible numbers of sheep that they had. Well, 1837 would be a Groundhog Day type year, or just a confluence of forces that would doom this great boom, that would just spell the end of it for the New England region. It would end the only period of true agricultural prosperity that we've ever had in New England. Yes, we've had dairy, we've had the potatoes, we had chickens, we've done all kinds of things. But in this time, and with this great boom, was tremendous wealth was created from the sale of wool. That 1837, it was the year of an economic panic. Andrew Jackson had abolished the equivalent of the Federal Reserve. A depression sat in the right afterwards that was very, very severe, had a profound effect on everybody. The Erie Canal and the railroads had been opened to the west, to western New York, to Ohio, on and on. And all of a sudden came wool that was being offered at a lower price from farms to the west, who had far greater feed resources and land, and they could make money with a lower wool price. So that hit the New England growers pretty hard. There was also competition beginning to come from Australia and the Argentine by ship. We could ship wool here. But a big factor was the coming of the Industrial Revolution. More and more people were working indoors, and they didn't need heavy woolen garments quite so much. And they kind of liked cotton. Cotton was a little more comfortable in hot weather, and so that was diminishing the demand for wool. And then there was also coming perfection of the box stove and central heat, and people didn't need great heavy blankets quite so much. So all of these things were working to diminish or put price pressure on the wool crop. But the biggest factor that would hit was the exhaustion of the upland soils. There were too many sheep for the carrying capacity of the land. They were overgrazing. And by 1837, they began to notice the soils not producing enough feed. The soils were becoming eroded. They just, particularly at the higher elevations, and then the exhaustion of the soil would continue and be a major factor in diminishing the economic viability of sheep farming. So we can look at the impacts of this period. It's a fascinating study in and of itself. Number one was the legacy. Well, I'll sum it up with the legacy. There were two significant ones. that are tangible on the landscape of New England today. Number one is thousands and thousands of miles of stone walls built to keep sheep in. Most of them were about 4 feet high, tall enough to keep a sheep in, won't keep a cow in. And the U.S. Department of Agriculture in 1871 did a study of the amount of stone walls in the northeastern United States, and they found there were in excess of 270,000 miles of stone walls. While we go all around anywhere in New England, we find stone walls, and they course through the forest, and that means at one time that land on either side of that stone wall was pasture and had sheep grazing. And so stone walls all over the place. And then the other is fine architecture. We have lovely houses. We often call a pretty house in New England, oh, that's a colonial house. If it's in a rural area, that house didn't look like that in colonial times. It was in the 1820s and the 1830s when there was cash in the economy to build and refine nice residences, and also nice public buildings were going up at that time. Churches and town halls and public buildings, and a lot of those are lovely, and they endure today because they were well built, and the people had money to do and invest in high quality. So anyway, those are the tangible, visible parts of the legacy, really the core of the legacy of this great prosperity, and then the impact of the decline of this period of prosperity had vast social ramifications, because people saw that there was diminished economic opportunity in raising sheep, and they packed up and left, and they went to Ohio, Illinois, Wisconsin, or the West Coast to farm, or they went into the industrial centers and started working in mills and shops and that sort of thing. And so there was a huge decline and exodus from rural central New England during the period from the Civil War to the turn of the 20th century. Towns that had in 1860 1,600 residents, by 1920 had 300 or 400 residents. Farms were abandoned and the land reverted to forest. It triggered a time of melancholy, really. It was great sadness, and there was just total frustration. There was nothing that could come along to replace the prosperity and the good times of the sheepdom. So that's it. It may be a little longer than you wanted, but
it was fabulous.
You have to look at, the big picture. It was a whole bunch of forces.
Yeah.
It wasn't just hey, we get some sheep and we'll shear them and sell wool and make some money. There was social implications, and there was physical, tangible things that we see today that endure.
A million, hold on, I got it. 1.7 million sheep in the state of Vermont alone by 1840.
Surely, 10-to-1 population-wise?
Yeah, the population was 300,000 at the top. And it had, it brought great capitalism and dollars to the state, and you don't think about it, but it was responsible for so many of the classic buildings that you see around, obviously the stone walls that Steve talks about. But then it absolutely, when it crashed hard, and it absolutely devastated the region and left a long tail of melancholy and depression behind it as people left, and as Steve said, dairy came in, but dairy didn't begin to replace the engine that sheep and sheep wool was to this region. So I hope you found that as interesting as I did.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see how things unfold with the continuation of agriculture in Vermont now that dairy has sort of been taking a little bit of a back step here.
Big step back.
Yeah.
But I don't think that, yes, there are small mini mills coming up, and folks are getting sheep, but they're not getting, and I don't think they'll ever get to the volume that was back then in the starting, began at around 1809 and then just kind of crashed after 1840-ish.
Yeah. Well,
quite the bubble. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it.
We will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.